When disaster strikes, you really appreciate resiliency. And there's nobody better to tell us about that than PJ Wilson. My guest today on the Solar Podcast is PJ Wilson of the Solar and Storage Association of Puerto Rico. Welcome to the show, PJ.
Thank you. It is great to be joining you today. Really appreciate it. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Yes, indeed. It's a new year, a new era. Hopefully, we're about to usher in the Biden administration here in the United States, which is going to be a breath of fresh air, literally and figuratively. And we can put so much gnarliness behind us, hopefully. Um, this is a homecoming for me, PJ. I want to thank you because you and I met in June of 2012 when I was a fundraising consultant. And while I knew a fair amount about solar from my youth, that was really my first professional contact with the industry. And you made a mark here in the Midwest with Renew Missouri, which is where you were the executive director for many years. And then strange things happened, and you had wanderlust. Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, and you made a radical decision to uproot yourself and relocate and create a new industry or a new association in Puerto Rico. Tell us about your journey.
That was so fun running into you earlier this year because it was many years ago where you were helping me figure out how to grow the roots deeper of the advocacy organization that I had in Missouri. That was I was really wanting to build that to the point where it could run without me. And your coaching there helped me figure out how to get the organization to run without me. So I'm so proud to say Renew Missouri is still fighting the good fight there, advocating for efficiency and renewables there in Missouri. And I didn't realize that your career had gone into the solar track until I ran into you in 3D space this summer at the Midwest Solar Expo conference. That was quite a treat.
That was fun. And you were so inspired by that virtual event to create a virtual event of your own, which, I want to hear a little bit about. But tell us, how did you get interested in renewable energy, PJ, and then get into the nonprofit advocacy side of the industry?
Sure, good question. Well, I didn't even think about energy until 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I just moved to San Francisco, just graduated from college, civil engineering degree, and was working in construction type stuff. And 9/11 really shook me, well, it shook everybody, but it really shook me to the core and made me start to ask the critical questions about, well, why are we so dependent on conflict areas of the world for energy? And why don't we just produce our own energy? That really got me started off on the track of renewable energy, wanting to work in it somehow or another. And at that time, I didn't even know how I felt about global warming, to tell you the truth. I didn't know how it worked. Somewhere along the way there, I came to understand through an article that I read by Stephen Hawking about how climate change works. So I thought, all right, great. Well, we got national security issues and you got climate change issues. This is kind of cutting edge, fun stuff that I want to work on. After I did the Peace Corps in Central America, I lived in Honduras for 2 years and did water and sanitation development work, and really, really enjoyed that. Loved living in Latin American culture, but wanted to focus on the clean energy thing. It felt like development work was great, but there was plenty of other people working on the water solution, the clean water challenge, and I wanted to work on clean energy. So I came back to the States. I got some training. I figured if I could become an effective clean energy advocate in my home state of Missouri, maybe that would prepare me to be able to work in developing areas of the world more. Little did I know that it would end up being Puerto Rico. This is my next step after Missouri, which is a developing place in many ways.
Yes, it is. And, honestly, most Americans know very little about Puerto Rico. I was a social worker in Chicago and worked with some Puerto Rican families. There is a big Puerto Rican population in Chicago, of course, a ginormous one in New York, and then also in Florida. Um, Puerto Rico has, you know, a status which is very fuzzy for us. So clarify that for us. What exactly is Puerto Rico's status within the United States?
So Puerto Rico, yeah, that it's my first few months here. I've been in Puerto Rico for just over 3 years, and for my first few months, when I was talking to people in the States, I would get confused sometimes and say Costa Rica instead of Puerto Rico. It has the same number of syllables. Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, kind of sounds similar. Far places you got to get an airplane to go to. So the difference between Costa Rica and Puerto Rico is Costa Rica is its own nation in Central America, and Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean that is a commonwealth of the United States. For all practical purposes, it is a colony. The word colony is not used very often. It was sort of rebranded in the 1950s, so the word colony isn't used. The word commonwealth is used, but it is a place where there are 3 million Americans that live that don't have the right to vote. They do not have representation in the House or the Senate at the federal level. They have one person called a resident commissioner that can be in the U.S. House of Representatives and be on committees, but can't vote. And so there's no direct representation there. So it's really, Puerto Rico is an island of 3 million Americans that are all second-class citizens. Now, Puerto Ricans can move to Florida or Missouri or Illinois whenever they want. They can freely travel without a passport. And it's interesting. About half of the things seem to be completely the same as they are in the US. Like if you fly here, your cell phone will work just fine. There's nothing foreign about that. Yet Puerto Ricans don't pay federal income tax. So the banking system is international. If you wire money to Puerto Rico, you have to use a SWIFT code, just like if you're wiring money to a foreign nation. So it's technically it's the oldest colony in the world. It's over 400 years that it's been either a colony of Spain or a colony of the US. But in the 1950s, they formed their own constitution. So now they have their own democratically elected governor and House of Representatives and Senate. So that is sort of the first layer of explaining what is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is part of the United States of America. That's the main thing to know. And it is different than any of the other 50 states.
Great, thank you. That was very clear. And you know, what's present for me is second-class citizens, and the United States is full of second-class citizens. It is a problem for us that we have to solve. Otherwise, we are going to continue to have a very unstable society in general. But we're not here to talk politics so much as we are to talk about clean energy and the clean energy transition. So I want to move us along. You were instrumental in establishing a 100% RPS in Puerto Rico. Tell us about SESA, the Solar Energy and Storage Association of Puerto Rico, and give us the lay of the land.
Sure. Yeah, it is. We'll probably keep coming back to touching on politics from different angles because it is so important. And that's one way. A new law was created 2 years ago in 2019. That's the 100% renewable portfolio standard in Puerto Rico. As opposed to Missouri, where I and my co-founder of Renew Missouri, Aaron Noble, we led the ballot measure charge to create the law. We were responsible for leading the charge for Missouri's renewable energy law. In Puerto Rico, I don't take credit for it. It wasn't because of me that the law got created, but my role in it was to form the Solar and Storage Industry Association of Puerto Rico. We affiliated with the National SEA, the National Trade Association. And through that, we were able to coordinate with all of the companies that were large enough to have attorneys to engage in what should that law be. So that is the part that there's two ways I was able to help. I wasn't involved in laying the groundwork for the momentum of creating that 100% renewable energy law in Puerto Rico. That credit all goes to local groups that have been working for years on that. The value add that I created was getting the solar companies together to coordinate their advocacy for the solar and storage components of that law. There was already a 20% renewable portfolio standard law in Puerto Rico. It was at that time, at the time Hurricane Maria hit, Puerto Rico was legally required to be at 12% renewable energy, but it is the only renewable portfolio standard to have failed. We're still at 3% renewable energy on the island. So, little known fact, when the 100% renewable energy law was filed, we as SESA, the Solar and Energy Storage Association, we were not in favor of it, because it just took the number 20% and turned it into 100% and didn't address any of the reasons why the first law didn't succeed. So getting together with all of the attorneys representing companies that could deeply engage in policy, we made a spreadsheet of 25 different changes that we wanted to that law, and we ended up getting 27 of them. We thought of 2 other things along the way. There was a really amazing spirit of bipartisan collaboration within the Senate and the House, and good communication with the governor at the time and the executive director of PREPA, the utility at the time. It was just viewed by everyone as a great opportunity to reset the public policy for energy on the island. And if we're going to reset things, well, let's go ahead and go for the gold. Let's go ahead and go for 100% renewable energy. So we didn't have the sort of push and pull that we had in Missouri. We were always fighting with the utility company, or fighting with consumer groups, or fighting with somebody about what we wanted for clean energy. There's no fighting here. There's universal. Everybody agrees we need to have more solar and storage. It's just a matter of how well can we organize and articulate what it is that we want, and how can we overcome the roadblocks that have resulted in the island still being just at 3% renewable energy. Pretty big delta there between 3% and 100%. And that's what we're helping to identify those roadblocks and figure out how to overcome them and get squarely on this path of actually going towards 100% renewable energy.
Yeah, I am a huge fan of renewable portfolio standards, and most of us in the energy industry understand that that is a foundational element of a successful clean energy market. But it's only the tip of the iceberg, right? There's so much more that has to happen. Here in Illinois, we have a 25% RPS since 2008, and the RPS has not been achieved, right? We are not still on track to get to 25% by 2025. And of course, now we have aspirations to secure 100% RPS, like many other cities and states across the United States. There's over 100 cities and states that have 100% RPSs, but there's a whole regulatory side to this. There's the whole landscape of utilities and their influence on the grid. And there are consumer advocacy organizations that come into play. So let's get down in the weeds a little bit. Is there going to be a boom of renewable energy in Puerto Rico in the near term?
That is a really good question. I think my simple answer to that for your listeners is, if you're really curious about the answer to that question, then I encourage you to get involved in helping be part of the solution, because it's not known. On paper, there's a 100% renewable portfolio standard that has the most aggressive transition to renewables in the nation, I think in the whole world. To go from 3% renewable energy today to the first big stair step is 40% by 2025. Now, to actually go to 40%, that means 3,500 megawatts of renewables has to be operating, generating electricity by 2025. That means it's got to be constructed. We got to break ground in construction here in the next couple of years. What is that looking like? Well, most recently, the regulator of the utility, it's called the Energy Bureau, the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau. They finished IRP, Integrated Resource Planning process, last month in December. And it said, yeah, well, 40% renewables, that's 3,500 megawatts. So utility, you better get going. You better start constructing this. They ordered them to put out an RFP for 1,000 megawatts of renewables with 500 megawatts of storage by December. And prioritize virtual power plants, prioritize the distributed generation, aggregation aspect of that. Now, PREPA has not done that yet. They haven't issued the RFP. They say they'll do it maybe this month, maybe next month. They've contracted with a consultant that said, well, 3,500 megawatts is kind of hard. They can only really imagine 200 megawatts going onto the grid right now. Uh, so you have here in Puerto Rico very strong public policy, very strong political support for the transition to renewable energy. You have a regulator that's pretty new. The Energy Bureau has only existed for 6 years or so. Before that, the utility was a government-owned monopoly utility. You can think of it like a municipal utility. You could think of Puerto Rico as a town of 3 million people in some ways. It operates like a municipal utility in many ways. But the utility has not wanted to do renewables along the way. They have not yet been transformed into a champion for renewable energy. At different stages in their development, they've either just flat out opposed moving forward or come up with technical barriers that are impossible or just that it's too expensive. As you can imagine, Puerto Rico is a place with lots of poverty. Mississippi is the poorest state in the nation, and Puerto Rico is twice as poor as Mississippi. The poverty rate is around 50%. It also has the second highest electric rates in the nation. Only Hawaii has electricity that's more expensive. So you've got the poorest population in the nation with almost the highest electric rates in the nation, which results in there being zero tolerance for rate increases. Anytime the rates need to go up, there's a strong temptation by whoever is governor at that time to just order rates not to go up, because whoever's governor seems to take the blame and get the credit for whatever goes good or bad. That's one reason that the utility itself is in bankruptcy, is that their rates didn't match up with their expenses for so many years that they ended up with $12 billion borrowed that they defaulted on. So these are some of the pieces in the puzzle. And I think most of your audience is going to be coming at this question from a business development perspective. As a clean energy developer, is there opportunity in Puerto Rico? Or as a manufacturer, is there demand for products? And the answer to that question is, yeah, there's some sort of market now, and it very well could become really hot soon, or it could get delayed longer. The good news, the best news, I think, is that we have strong federal leadership now. That's been more than 3 years since the hurricane that resulted in Congress appropriating $20 billion for the Department of Housing and over $30 billion for FEMA funds to come help Puerto Rico. The vast majority of that money hasn't come here because the previous federal administration did not like Puerto Rico and was not good at managing anything. So now that we have good leadership at the federal level, we expect to have that federal support come. We've got over $10 billion that's coming for the grid. And that $10 billion could either go to rebuilding the grid in a way that is focused on fossil fuel generation, or it could go to rebuilding the grid in a way that helps more renewable energy come online. That's what we're cheering for, of course. You've got the Department of Housing's $20 billion grant for Puerto Rico. It's the biggest grant in the history of the Federal Department of Housing. And at least $2.5 billion of that is for energy in Puerto Rico. And so we're directing, we're advocating that be directed towards solar and storage incentives first and foremost, because in Puerto Rico, it's solar and storage to save lives. After Hurricane Maria was the biggest blackout in the history of the nation, the second most devastating one in the history of the world. That is why 4,000 people died, lack of electricity. Not just in their houses, but also the hospitals didn't have electricity. So it wasn't worth going to the hospital if you were sick because you knew the hospital was closed. They didn't even have power. So all of these are pieces of the puzzle that are important to understand if you are a developer that you don't want to sell some batteries, you just want to finance some projects. You've got to slow down and understand all these basic building blocks about what the lay of the land is in Puerto Rico and really have a good dose of patience. One message that I have is that there's no easy money to be made in Puerto Rico. You can't just be transactional and throw some money in and get some money out. It really is more of a process of understanding the Puerto Rico culture, learning the Spanish language to the best extent possible, and partnering with local businesses that have skin in the game. That's the secret to success that I would share. Slow down, partner with local people, develop an appreciation for the culture and language and the process. And yes, there is money to be made on clean energy development in Puerto Rico.
I mean, one of the foundations that we think of when we think of islands in general and island nations, or island commonwealths is that energy is relatively expensive. Most of the energy has to be brought in the form of either oil or coal or natural gas, right? And and so the price of energy to consumers is relatively high compared to most mainland communities. Not always, but usually. That's why Hawaii has the highest penetration of solar in the United States. And, that's probably a good comparison, though. You're putting the finger on the fact that Puerto Rico is twice as poor as Mississippi is very thought provoking. and and then there's that context of when the grid goes down, people die. We in the United States on the mainland generally don't have long-term outages. The outage that Puerto Rico endured was very long-term, on the order of months, right, for many residents. And when you don't have refrigeration, you don't have uh, hospitals that are functioning, right, people die. Just one more. I don't want to be too macabre about this, but if there's a massive grid outage, let's say a massive solar storm wipes out the grid in North America, 3/4 of the population is dead in 2 years because we are no longer hunter gatherer animals. We are go to the grocery store and go to the doctor's office. If you don't have internet, if you don't have electricity, you don't have internet, and everything comes to a grinding halt, and the stores are empty very quickly. So um, this is very prescient, and we can see, I think, Puerto Rico as a canary in the coal mine, really, uh, that we need to learn and get better at creating resiliency because it's totally possible, PJ, right? We have the technology, as as Jiggershaw loves to say, right? It's all about deployment. It's not about doing more R&D and bringing down the cost and so forth. You can deploy renewable energy at the same or lower cost of grid power in most places now.
I just gotta interrupt you and note that Jigger Shaw was very helpful in Missouri when we were getting clean energy things going there, and I'm just thrilled to see that I've almost caught up with him in stature in the clean energy space because he was just 2 guests ago on your show, right? And all of a sudden now I've
That's
almost
right.
caught up with Jigger Shaw.
You're nipping at Jigger's heels. And no, we're grateful for Jigger's leadership, and we're grateful for your leadership, PJ. It, you are boldly going where few people go, and so it takes tremendous courage and patience and smarts. So power to you. And please, if you're listening to this podcast, go to SESA-PR.org. That's SESA's website, SESA-APR. So SESA-PR.org, and join the Solar and Storage Association of Puerto Rico. So let's I loved what you said about if you're a developer or if you're a manufacturer looking to sell product, here's what to think about. And I saw that here in Illinois when we got the RPS, when we got FEJA, the Future Energy Jobs Act, signed in 2016, came into force in 2017. It was a new day. The developers, the proactive developers, had already been on the ground securing lease option agreements for a couple of years. They saw the writing on the wall that there was going to be a boom in Illinois. You couldn't predict exactly when it happened. And Jiggershaw pointed out that, it wasn't going to happen until like 6 days before it happened. And the stars aligned and deals were made in back rooms, and it was a trade-off, right? Because the nuclear industry is getting $200 million a year, the renewables industries are getting $200 million a year, and I don't think that's fair, but at least we have a renewable energy industry now in Illinois. So it is the early bird that gets the worm. Let's talk about what else and how early birds can engage. Obviously, engaging with your organization is fundamental. What else can developers do? What success stories do you see, I suppose, of developers and manufacturers that are making or getting traction?
Sure. Well, that is, yeah, that is part of what I have to offer is that I'm the founder and president of the Solar and Energy Storage Association. So when I say that businesses, it's important to understand the lay of the land and all these different things that are happening in tandem in Puerto Rico to understand the market opportunity. One really helpful way to accelerate your process is to join SESA. We do frequent meetings with our member-only meetings. We can kind of boil down what is going on. If we know what the business model is of companies, whether they're manufacturers or developers or finance companies or installation companies, EPCs, if we know what it is you're trying to accomplish, then we can help kind of steer you towards the opportunities that are coming up that we think would be worth your time to pay extra special attention to. So yeah, join. Yeah, I think that's true anywhere. You know, join your local industry association and use them, but especially here in Puerto Rico, and especially for companies that aren't in business on the island yet, and the ones that are. But I think most of your listeners will probably be from off island. So this is a way to catalyze your understanding of whether now is the right time or not. You know, you might decide you want to wait a few years until things change. But
So if we imagine that 3,500 megawatts is going to be deployed a third residential, a third commercial and small utility, and a third utility scale. Let's just imagine, okay.
sure.
What that means is there is opportunities across the spectrum, but where do you see the opportunity in the next 3 to 5 years? Is it at the utility scale or is it more at the DG side?
Well, on the utility side of things, there is going to be sometime soon a big RFP issued by the utility, and it is going to include siting recommendations. It's going to include a map of the island and where the substations are that are cheap, that cost the least amount of money to develop interconnection with. Utility scale developers should watch that RFP very closely because it might be successful. At the same time, they should know that there were over 1,200 megawatts contracted for by the utility 8 years ago that were not successful. So there was a lot of money spent and wasted on buying up the rights to develop solar, to develop wind for projects that didn't go forward. And that was because of political instability. You know, those contracts were signed under one governor, and then the next governor came in and said, I don't like those contracts, so they're not going to go forward. And then the next governor came in and said, okay, maybe we can find a solution. And then now it's 2 governors later, and there's probably the most money to be made in utility scale developments, but it takes a lot of patience to imagine that it's going to be successful. It's not impossible though, because of the federal funding that could help solve that puzzle. Like, it's very possible that large scale projects could go forward. My advice to those developers is, if you're off island, is to partner with local Puerto Rican businesses. So you have skin in the game together, do a joint venture type of thing. It's not like, oh, hey, there's an opportunity in Alabama, so let's use our business model and just expand into there. It is a different culture. It's a different language. You want to avoid being hometowned anywhere. You always want to have some degree of local partnering, but here in Puerto Rico especially, you want to have it be a collaborative process with local developers. So there's potentially a lot of opportunity on the utility side of things. That said, no utility projects have moved forward in the last 7 years, so it's pretty risky. And your off-taker is bankrupt. PREPA is a utility company that is in bankruptcy court and will be for the foreseeable future. Maybe they'll come out of bankruptcy this year, but maybe it'll be 3 years, maybe it'll be 5 years, maybe it'll be 10 years. It depends on a lot of different factors. So maybe there's opportunity in the utility scale and space, and maybe it's huge. What has been happening for the last few years is a steady growth of residential and commercial. Like, those are the off-takers that are creditworthy. People that can say, yeah, I'll take out a loan for the solar system, or I'll do a lease. One of the most successful companies has been Sonova. There's around 25,000 residential systems on this island, and half of those are thanks to Sonova. Through their loans, their leases, their PPAs, they've developed half the residential market that's here. So they've shown that it is possible for a finance company that wants to use their business model to adapt it locally and succeed. I think that's part of what has given Sunrun confidence. Their major competitor, Sunrun, is now in the market here in the residential space and growing. So there's definitely a residential market, and it will definitely be growing because people buy solar with storage because of fear of blackouts. That's the prime motivator here. Yes, it's cheaper. Yes, it's better for the environment, but here in Puerto Rico, it saves your life during the next blackout, which could be a few months from now. You know, hurricane season is 4 months away already, and the next one's just 12 months behind there. So
Yeah.
yeah, residential, commercial, industrial, those markets exist and will be humming along, and there will be increasing opportunity there for involvement for sure. Um, and utility scale probably will work one way or another, and probably sooner rather than later. But it remains to be seen if that means that utility scale developers should bid on this RFP that comes out next month, or if it means they should monitor that and watch what happens and jump in with the second cycle.
I want to talk a little more about PREPA, the utility, but you mentioned Sonova's success. Can you say more about how they have been successful?
Yeah, so they have about 7 years on the island. They went through a few different business models when they entered the market. Um, One thing that they have offered is, as a US based company, they are able to take advantage of the ITC. So they're able to factor that into their pricing. Uh, there is not much financing available for solar in Puerto Rico. There's not very many banks that of the major banks that offer solar loan products. There are some of the banking cooperatives that do, but it's still a novel concept. We have 1% penetration of distributed generation on the island. Only 1% of the island's power comes from rooftop solar. So Sonova was able to come in and say, okay, well, why aren't more people going solar in their houses? Well, they can't afford the upfront costs. They don't want to pay for the maintenance risk over time. So their model, they come in and they say, all right, well, how about if you just pay us for 20 or 25 years, about the same as what you would have paid to PREPA anyway. But since they own the systems, they maintain the systems. If the battery breaks 10 years later, they come in and give a new battery. So it's sort of a foreign concept. Like it's a leasing, whether it's structured as a PPA or lease. They do have a loan product too, so that's available. But mostly it's a PPA or a lease model, which is not very common in Puerto Rico. If you want to buy a car or rent a car or lease a car, there's not very many leases that happen. Like normal for cars, from what I can tell, is about 6 years of a lease. Like you have to make a 6-year commitment, and people don't like it very much. It's not very common. So for Sonova to educate customers about the benefits of leasing solar on their roof and a battery in their garage has been something that's taken them a while, but they have figured out how to succeed. They've got 5 local solar companies that are their EPCs, and they provide the financing. That's just one of the options that all those 5 companies offer. So it's tenacity. Like their business succeeded because they didn't give up along the way, and because their CEO John Berger is deeply committed to Puerto Rico, and he'll tell you that anytime you ask. And I think that's indicative of what it takes to succeed. Truly wanting to make a positive difference in Puerto Rico, not focusing on wanting to make a buck, but truly wanting to help the energy paradigm in Puerto Rico, and not giving up along the way at one of the many times when it seems like giving up would be the logical thing to do.
Well, I think you put your finger on something that's vital for developers to understand. When you're building a market and creating a track record for long-term success, you have to focus on value creation and the well-being of the population at large, not just how do we make a buck and move on. And there is, our industry is a spectrum, right, of capitalists and capitalists that also believe in a cause and firmly are promoting the energy transition. Luckily, a majority of energy professionals, I would argue, in solar and wind and storage are fundamentally pro energy transition and care about it. It's just a question of how deep that root goes. And so,
Yeah, and I think we're seeing it get deeper. Like in the, I'm not a finance specialist, but noticing that large institutions are divesting from fossil fuel stuff. The Rockefeller Federation is the most recent huge organization I've heard of that has said, you know what, they are not investing a penny in fossil fuels going forward. Well, they got to invest that money in something. And you're seeing socially motivated investing happen more and more. Right before this podcast, I was talking with a finance person who said, "Hey, he's got the pension fund of the country of the UK pension fund, like government pension fund. They're wanting to make socially impactful investments, and they're able to pick and choose. They want their money to really make a difference. So they're assessing the Puerto Rico market. You know, they could make money lots of different ways, but they want to make a difference too. We're seeing a lot of that. There's a lot of capital available to help Puerto Rico, but 9 times out of 10, it doesn't end up being invested in Puerto Rico because of the political instability. If you have a really credit-worthy off-taker, like a pharmaceutical company that's probably going to be here for a long time, then you can move forward. But if you're going to make a deal with the government of Puerto Rico or the government-owned utility of Puerto Rico, then how can you guarantee that things won't go sideways when the society collapses because the governor quits? That just happened 2 years ago. So if that could happen another 2 years from now, you never know. Or this governor could be great and the next one could be more fragile. That's what scares away most of the investment capital, is just when you try and build that into risk, like what number do you put in there for how risky the market is. That's one hope that we have for federal dollars under the Biden administration. There are many billions of dollars available for helping the energy paradigm in Puerto Rico, and that kind of buying down that risk or giving the federal guarantees to loans, so that even if the local government does fall apart, you have a federal guarantee of PPAs being honored. Or if you have the federal government as the buyer, if the federal government itself bids and says, yeah, well, they will pay for the output from a solar farm or wind farm, then there's a number of different ways that the federal support can be helpful. And we're confident under the Biden administration that there's goodwill there and a genuine desire to say, okay, what can the federal government do to be more helpful than throwing a paper towel roll or two?
so PREPA is, well, let me just ask the question. Who owns PREPA? And I saw a story in the Wall Street Journal about a company called Quanta Services, which seems like a very large utility services company, which was awarded some kind of a contract to manage PREPA. But what's the deal with PREPA, and why did they bankrupt? Not that bankruptcy is so unusual for utilities. We see in California that PG&E is now in bankruptcy again, uh, for the second time, I think, in the last decade. So these kinds of things are not that unusual, but tell us more about that story.
PG&E is an interesting example. Actually, we just had at the conference that we did 2 years ago, or I'm sorry, 2 months ago, one of the sessions was we had the vice president of regulatory affairs for PG&E do a session with the executive director of the utility here to talk about the similarities there, because in California, they've got wildfires that are caused by climate change and are going to get more intense over the short, probably a medium future anyway, and cause more blackouts there. And here in Puerto Rico, we've got blackouts because of climate change caused hurricanes, and both utilities are bankrupt. So they actually have a lot in common. So that was a really interesting session. What is the deal with PREPA? So they are a government-owned monopoly utility. I think a good way to think about them would be municipal utility. If they were a municipal utility, they'd be the biggest one in the nation with 3 million people, population of 3 million that they're over. They are in bankruptcy for reasons that are really well articulated. If there's anybody listening that really wants to know the story, there's a fascinating report. If you just Google Final Investigative Report Puerto Rico, it was U.S. government commissioned this firm to just study and try and answer that question. Why did Puerto Rico go bankrupt? The short explanation is their costs exceeded their revenues. Their rates weren't high enough to cover their costs, so they just kept borrowing money. Well, why were their rates too low? Well, it's because of political pressure. Whoever's the governor would take the heat for rates going up. So there was multiple times over PREPA's history where the governor would order the rates to go down, even though that meant they had to borrow money that they didn't have. So Puerto Rico found itself in bankruptcy, and this was a few months before the hurricane hit. This was in summer of 2017 that they stopped making payments on their $12 billion in debt. So what are they supposed to do next? Well, now there's a very long, complicated bankruptcy proceeding happening. The federal government created a law called PROMESA that has a federal oversight committee. It's called the Fiscal Oversight Management Board, that really acts like a fourth branch of government here that can trump all three other branches if it wants on financial matters. They can say, well, we don't like your budget for the year, so we need to have you make these changes. It's not just PREPA, it's also the entire government of Puerto Rico that is in bankruptcy. There was just a lot of borrowing that happened over the late 90s and early 2000s. If you're really going to get involved in the Puerto Rico market, then you need to understand why the entire society ended up in bankruptcy, and how in the 80s and 90s, the Puerto Rico economy roared because of really rich federal manufacturing incentives that were passed at the federal level. And then it shrank because those manufacturing tax credits went away at the end of the 90s and the 2000s. So it's not just the utility, it's the whole society that kind of got used to really artificially rapid growth, and then that growth went away, which resulted in bankruptcy, and it resulted in out migration. Like there's not very many jobs, so people are still moving off of the island. All of these factors are important to understand if you're really gonna know, okay, why is Puerto Rico in bankruptcy, and why is the utility company in particular in bankruptcy? Now, all that aside, looking forward, probably one of the most key questions is, how is the utility going to get out of bankruptcy? This is something that we are cheering for, because it's hard to imagine their 1,000 megawatts RFPs having developers bid and borrow money and construct solar with the off-taker being bankrupt. They do need to get out of bankruptcy so that they can have some sort of credit, and then developers can borrow money to build solar. However, the current deal on the table is to give those give bondholders 70 cents on the dollar, so repay them 70% of what they had loaned to Puerto Rico, which whether that's a good deal is outside my field of expertise. But what is in my field of expertise is that the deal says 64 times the one thing that's most important to them is taxing solar customers, businesses and homes. Put a meter on your solar panel and you pay 5 cents a kilowatt hour on that output. That is fundamentally important to them in getting repaid for their debt, which puts them squarely at odds with the solar industry, because solar taxes is not something that, it's number one priority for the solar industry not to have, solar taxes. And it also puts them squarely at odds with energy efficiency. If you imagine the bondholders are dependent on a 5 cent per kilowatt hour charge on customers, well, if energy efficiency is successful, you're going to have a lot less kilowatt hours sold, so that it just hurts the bondholders. That is part of the dynamic that we're trying to flip the script on and say, hey, why don't you repay the debt with the savings from energy efficiency? If we're able to change the paradigm entirely there, then bondholders will be naturally motivated to support energy efficiency and support solar development. That's something we're really trying to help with. We are optimistic with the new leadership at the federal level and the local level that a lot of these multi-billion-dollar questions that are happening in silos will be able to be solved together. Now, you asked about Quanta. So yeah, Quanta is a large utility development company that won a bid to do the operation of the Puerto Rico power grid. So PREPA, as we know it today, is on a pathway to not exist anymore soon. They have been ordered by Puerto Rico law to privatize the operation of the grid under the theory that a private grid operator could be more efficient and easier to regulate by the regulator. This is one of the frustrations that I've heard, is that it comes across with a government regulator regulating a government-owned utility. Well, what happens if the government-owned utility doesn't do what the regulator wants? They can assess a fine, but those fines don't come out of anyone's profits because it's all government money. So it just comes across as a rate increase and makes it hard for the regulator to regulate. The whole theory is that with a private grid operator, the regulator will be able to say, look, do what we say or we're going to fine you, and those fines come out of your profits. So that's the idea. Now, this company, Quanta, went together with a couple of other companies and formed a coalition called LUMA, L-U-M-A, LUMA. So that's the brand name that they're using here on the island. They won this RFP to operate the PREPA grid last summer 2020. If all goes on schedule, they will be the private grid operator in June of this year. And at that point in time, PREPA's responsibility for operating the grid would be over. And the only thing PREPA as an entity would do would be to operate the power plants that they own. They are also doing an RFP to sell the power plants that they own. So this is important to keep in mind. Okay, if a developer wants to have PREPA as an off-taker, PREPA is on its way out of existence, in addition to being in bankruptcy. The government, the model that is in place is that the government would still own the assets, would still own the wires and the distribution and transmission lines, but all the generation would be privatized and the operation of the grid would be privatized. And that is the model that's moving forward. Whether or not it will succeed is unpredictable. There's a big rate of failure of privatizing public utilities in Latin America, like a long history of water and power privatization attempts succeeding and failing along the way. So we'll see if that succeeds or not. From the solar development perspective, we hope that it does succeed, because if it doesn't, no one knows what's going to happen. So if there's a way a private grid operator can come in and operate the grid in a way that encourages more solar to come online and storage, and it really takes advantage of the benefits of virtual power plant models, is not tethered to building new fossilized generation, but is open to hundreds of thousands of homes having batteries that can act together as a dispatchable power source, then we're hopeful that that's how things go.
Yeah, you can imagine the economy is so fundamentally dependent on a reliable grid. It's one of the foundations for modern society. And so I think it's a good experiment to at least try with privatization, because then the grid operator has a motive to have a more resilient, robust grid. It can come at a cost to consumers, and you don't want them to gouge the consumers. So that's something that you have to be very careful about. And there are many examples of corruption with U.S. utilities here in the United, on the mainland as well, doing nefarious things. But you can imagine that Puerto Rico's economy is heavily industrial. There is a large manufacturing base. Upwards of 50% of the economy comes from manufacturing, and so if you're a manufacturer, yes, you have this affordable labor force that is not going to be too demanding, but do you have the infrastructure necessary to run your pharmaceutical plant or your electronics manufacturing facility in a profitable manner? So in the last few minutes we have, PJ, let's peer a little into the future and touch on your vision for the future of Puerto Rico. Let's just paint a picture for a best case scenario, because that's truly how we invent the future, right? We go long. You see this with Elon Musk and the electrification of transportation, and we need more positive futures to be envisioned.
I like that idea. Yeah, let's end off talking about that, because if you've been listening to this whole thing, you might be frustrated by this point and hearing all the complicated aspects of trying to do business in Puerto Rico. But there really is opportunity here. And and staying focused on the best case scenario and putting in elbow grease to try and make that happen is what I enjoy the most. So let's say things succeed. What that looks like is that energy efficiency happens, which means massive education campaigns about what energy efficiency even is. And it means that trucks show up in neighborhoods to take away the 30-year-old refrigerator that's leaking for free, and then replace it with a new one that costs half as much as it normally would have. And then it takes those people telling their neighbors that that happened. And then they say, well, we want one of those too. And then before you know it, you see a quick growth of efficient appliances happening. And the other energy efficiency programs working, when they say, well, now you got a new efficient fridge and air conditioner. Did you want a battery in your garage that provides power when the grid goes down? Well, yes, I'd like a battery. So this sort of intersection between energy efficiency, demand response, and renewable energy is I think the best case scenario going forward. And with every person that participates in that, them becoming an evangel for teaching their friends and their coworkers about how those concepts work. So what you end up with is people saving money. They're spending less money on their energy bills because they have more efficient houses and appliances. And the whole grid is less expensive because they're less dependent on these very fickle fossil fuel plants and the fragile infrastructure that goes to them. So you have well-being of the economy of Puerto Rico because you have more stable power, you have more decentralized power, you have cheaper power, and that helps stop the out-migration of the population of the island. So you have more people staying in Puerto Rico, more jobs in Puerto Rico, more people moving back from New York or Florida or whatever they've gone to because there just hasn't been work. What I was talking about earlier with the sort of artificial inflation of the economy back in the 80s and 90s, I think the best case scenario for Puerto Rico is the development of the economy in a not artificial way, just using the advantages of what's here to really find its own way in growing. So sort of its own place in the world stage from an economic point of view. Of course, my focus will be on the backbone of the energy economy and shifting away from 97% dependence on fossil fuels that have come in on boats towards 100% energy independence. Probably also fundamental in that is growing their own food. There's 85% of the food on this island comes in from boats. So just imagine your scenario where the solar flares knock out the whole power grid. If we don't have boats bringing food every day to this island, then people just starve to death. So more energy independence, more power independence will reduce the poverty rate on the island, will reduce the trauma and help the well-being of the whole society.
Indeed. I wonder how, when you talk to Puerto Ricans about the situation, the fact that they are second-class citizens officially, don't get to vote in US elections, what do they want?
That could be the whole topic of another podcast that I would invite local Puerto Ricans to participate in. But as an outsider, someone that moved here from Missouri, I can tell you that I was shocked to find out that I knew that Puerto Ricans couldn't vote and weren't a state. So I always assumed that they wanted to be. I knew there was some talk under the Obama administration about maybe a pathway to statehood. So I assumed that everybody in Puerto Rico wanted that. Turns out, no, there is right around 50% of the island that passionately would like to become a state, and right around another 50% that passionately does not want to become a state, because becoming a state means losing language and culture and local control. Like right now, all of the income tax money stays on the island. So it's local politicians that get to decide how it's spent. But if Puerto Rico becomes a state, then all of a sudden a lot of money is going off the island, and it's people in Washington, D.C. that are deciding the well-being of folks here. So what do people in Puerto Rico want? It's been 400 years since that question was able to really be asked and answered. And at that point in time, it was local Taino Indians living here. Now it's mostly Spanish blood. Most people on the island are Spanish in nature. And what do they want? I think it's hard for them to imagine what they really want politically. It's easy for half the population to say we want to be a state and things would be easier on that pathway. And the other half feels like we don't want that. We want to stay in the status we are now, but have more rights and maybe one day be independent from America. But they don't want to be poor. They want the potholes to be filled in the roads. They don't want energy prices to be high. They want to have jobs. There's a lot that is clear, and those are the things that I want to help with.
Yeah, I think there was one thing about the future of SESA that we didn't touch on. SESA is an industry association. What else stands in the near term future of your work there in Puerto Rico?
Sure, good question. So SESA is the Industry Association for Solar and Storage, and it is 3 years old now. It is fairly mature. We still need more companies to join. There's 20 member companies, which includes the manufacturer Tesla. It includes the local residential developers. We just had the first utility scale developer join the board, Synetics. So it's SESA needs the rest of the industry to join. All the serious players in solar and storage, I'm encouraged to join SESA, and we will help your business succeed. The other advocacy groups that need to be created, this is what I feel like my main organizational gifts to Puerto Rico is, one, the creation of the Solar and Storage Association that I hope to build and be independent as soon as it can. And also a 501c3 nonprofit clean energy advocacy entity that doesn't exist yet. A nonprofit that is not funded by companies, it's funded by foundation dollars and major donors. And it is similar to Fresh Energy in Minnesota and Renew Missouri, where I'm from, and able to look more at the medium and long-term policy opportunities. And those are the sort of two strings of the kite that I built in Missouri, to have an industry association and also a 501c3 nonprofit that work separately from each other, but work together as allies. That's my other short-term goal is this year to get funding for the Renew Puerto Rico, the renewable energy focused policy advocacy organization that can spend more time working with the environmental groups and the consumer advocates and the education of the politicians side of things, whereas SESA always has to focus on how can we help our member companies profits, which touches on those things, but it's sort of missing that other string of the kite here to have the clean energy nonprofit, both of those nonprofits. SESA is a nonprofit trade association, and one thing that I see as missing is a 501c3 nonprofit that's just focused on clean energy advocacy and energy efficiency for all forms of renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Excellent. Well, how can our listeners reach you, PJ Wilson?
Well, SESA, the SESA-PR.org is our website. So you can always go there and send us a message. You can email info@SESA-PR.org, SESA, SESA-PR.org. If you're a company that is not yet in the loop, then just go to the website and click on apply to be a member. And then that just really means you're taking the first step in the membership journey, which is giving us some basic background information about your company. And then we have a call with you to talk more about details of SESA and your company and see if that's a good fit for to move forward. So yeah, just look us up online, SESA-PR.org. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We do current events posting on social media. So we depend on that's free. You can just follow us on Twitter and Facebook and start to get our updates and see more about what we're up to that way too.
Excellent. Thank you, PJ. I want to make a couple of announcements. We do these interviews twice a week, and you can find all of this content at cesnrg.com/podcast. We cover topics like agrivoltaics. We cover topics like the $1 trillion wealth creation opportunity with Jigar Shah. And then we dive into technology like DC coupled storage with Hanan Fishman from Alan Khan. DC coupled storage is staged to really explode in North America. And we get into tracker technology with Next Tracker Gemini 2 and Portrait with a contractor called Sunshine Solar with Emily O'Leary. So check us out, cesnrg.com/podcast. Please subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up if you appreciate this content. We are growing the industry by thousands, tens of thousands of individuals need to come into the clean energy industries to make us achieve the successful energy transition. So please join us, give us a thumbs up. And I want to thank PJ Wilson, the founder and president of the Solar and Storage Association of Puerto Rico, for coming on the show. I wish you the best. And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. Thank you, PJ.
Thank you, Tim. I hope you and I working together, turning into you having a career in solar as turns into the magic touch for all your listeners.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.